Hello, my name is Catherine Schobey, and this is my bilingual ESL timeline. So we're going to start with the 1800s to early 1900s. In 1800s, German, Czech, and Polish immigrants settled in Texas around the time Texas became independent. Germans were actually accredited for the first school in Texas in San Antonio, and they had primarily English-speaking schools. President LBJ, who had incorporated Spanish into his English language instruction while teaching as a young man in what was then known as the Mexican School in Cotulla, Texas. And we also had 1924 Myers versus Nebraska. Nebraska passed a law prohibiting teaching grade school children any language other than English. Meyer, who taught German in a Lutheran school, was convicted under this law. It also included the right of a teacher to teach German to a student and the right to control the upbringing of their child for parents as they see fit. And from the 1920s to the 1960s, English immersion or sink or swim policies were dominant for teaching.
And the first day of school, I started in grade 0 because I didn't know English, as did most of my barrio friends. And the first day of school, I hollered to a friend of mine que me aventara la pelota, not realizing that I was violating anything. The teacher immediately said, "You cannot speak Spanish, go to Mr. Harvey's office, the principal, to be punished." And there was a long line of students there every day being punished for speaking.
Next, we'll start the 1960s. We'll start with 1958, the Little School of the 400. It was an educational project developed in Texas by Felix Terjena and the LULAC during the 1950s, and it was sought to teach Spanish-dominant preschool children a speaking vocabulary of 400 basic English words so that they could overcome the language barrier and successfully complete the first grade. Then we had in 1963 the U.S. Dual Language School Approach, also known as the Choral Approach. This was a form of education in which students were taught literacy and content in 2 languages. Most dual language programs taught in English and Spanish, but the programs increased in using Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, French, Hawaiian, Japanese, and Korean. Then in 1967, the TE accreditation standard allowed school districts to offer non-English speaking children an instructional program using 2 different languages. And in 1968, we had the Bilingual Education Act, also known as the BEA, Title VII of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It helped benefit the students by providing education at a federal level, supplemental funding, and training and operation for these programs. We also had in the 1960s a radicalized Mexican-American movement known as the Chicano movement, also known as El Movimiento, through political empowerment through Chicanismo or Cesar Chavez movement. In 1969, the letter from Delano, he wrote, "The color of our skins, the languages of our cultural and native origins, the lack of formal education, the exclusion from the democratic process, the numbers of our slain in recent wars, all of these burdens generation after generation have sought to demoralize us, but we are not agricultural implements or rented slaves. We are men."
The name Chicano was a way to identify ourselves because we weren't Mexican citizens, we weren't Spaniards, we were Chicanos, Mexican Americans, and we gave ourselves the name. The word Chicano was a name of resistance, a name of defiance, a name of self-identity. This is who we became. This is what we were establishing during the late 60s and the early 70s was self-identity, self-determination.
The term Chicano is used primarily by the group of people that become very socially conscious, that make socially conscious decisions to join the social movement for the betterment of the community. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have a new Mexican-American cultural type. Yes, we've Americanized, but to a great extent, we've Americanized on our own terms, not only in ethnic terms, but in broad cultural terms.
The Chicano cultural renaissance of that time, of the 60s into the 70s, all of that was happening at that time, poetry, readings, music, festivals, murals, it was exciting times. The Chicanos that were there in Austin, man, at the university and in the barrio, we were turned on, man. And we formed CASA, Chicano Art Students Association, and we began doing sort of events, collaborative events there at the university and started hooking up with the barrio.
There were actually multiple situations that happened in Texas as well as many other states, such as California. At Edgewood High School in San Antonio, they had a walkout during the Chicano movement. The teachers kept students from leaving and tried to block other students from walking out, but they just walked right past
They
them.
invited me to a demonstration. 10 or 15,000 kids walked out and protested against a discriminatory system of education. They had picketed before, they had been arrested before, but never on this magnitude. I was struck with emotion. I remembered my own grammar school revolt, and I realized a bit of my life was catching up with me.
The strike was very effective. It certainly captured the public imagination. This shocked the establishment.
After the demonstration, the organizers were ousted from their offices and their homes and charged with felony conspiracy. It was a pretty serious charge with 45 years of their life riding on the outcome. A life sentence for speaking out against injustice?
We're going to turn over now to the 70s and 80s. In 1972, we had the Texas Association for Bilingual Education. It was inspired by MALDEF, LULAC, IDRA, and the American GI Forum. The TABE started with the mission to advocate for Texas's language minority children and the institutionalization of bilingual education and ESL education in Texas schools. And in 1974, we had Lau versus Nichols. It was brought by Chinese parents in San Francisco, leads to the ruling that identical education does not constitute equal education under Title VI of the Civil Rights of 1964. This ruling established that the Office for Civil Rights under the former Department of Health, Education, and Welfare had the authority to establish regulations for Title VI enforcement. In 1981, we had the Commons model of second language acquisition. He believes that if a learner had already learned a language, namely their native tongue, then they are readily equipped to learn a second. In 1981, we had Castañeda versus Pickard. This district was filed against the Raymondville Independent School District, or ISD, in Texas by Roy Castañeda. He was the father of two Mexican-American children, and he claims that they were discriminating against his children because of their ethnicity. This brought about meeting the requirements of the Equal Educational Opportunities Act, where the bilingual program must be based on sound educational theory. The program must be implemented effectively with resources for personnel, and after a trial period, the program must be proven effective in overcoming language barriers and handicaps. In 1981, we had the U.S. versus Texas. The District Court for the Eastern Texas District, it was in Tyler, instructs CEA to phase in mandatory bilingual education in K through 12 schools. This led to 3-year monitoring cycles. In 1982, they had the results of Plyler versus Doe, where they had originally had in 1975 the education code permitting public school districts to deny admission or charge tuition to undocumented children. However, a 5-4 U.S. Supreme Court decision in Plyler versus Doe struck down the section and ruled all children, regardless of their citizenship, were entitled to free public education under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In 1986, the State Board of Education created TEAMS, or Texas Educational Assessment of Minimal Skills. This developed later into TAS, TAX, and TELPAS that we use today. We'll be wrapping up as we reach the 90s to present day, starting with 1994, the BEA Reauthorization Act, which introduced new grant categories, set up a preference to programs promoting bilingualism, and took into account indigenous languages. Overall, the premise of this edition was to introduce a more systematic form. In 1995, we had the beginning of the Texas Education Code, and in 2001, we had the No Child Left Behind Act, and this was promoted in 2015 by the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is intended to ensure families that are empowered to support their children's learning that all students receive a high-quality, well-rounded education that prepares them for long-term successes. A major provision of this was to basically repeal the adequate yearly progress rules of the No Child Left Behind Act, replacing them with a state-defined accountability system. As we have seen from our text and multiple other resources, that the world, the internet, and even Texas are continuously ever-changing, involving education, and they're developing. It has the potential to increase bilingual and multilingual communication and growth. It provides new possibilities, as well as a place to be different, distinct, and diverse, to overall help our students and the next generations.
Students continue to encounter barriers to full participation in schools, including obstacles in the enrollment process, lack of adequate English language assistance services for students who are English learners, lack of communication about programs in languages that parents with limited English proficiency can understand, and harassment on the basis of national origin by students or staff. The Departments of Education and Justice remain committed to addressing these issues and to furthering the promise of equal educational opportunity for all children.
All right, and here are my citations. I had a really great time doing this project, and it will definitely be a great resource for me in years to come as I continue to grow and as Texas continues to grow and hopefully the whole world. Thank you so much for listening.